advancing equity and access. And so there's a debate that's still happening, that's still happening today. I just want to note that the policy actually was amended a few years after it was implemented to include not just racial and ethnic minorities, but students who come from low socioeconomic status, so it was a focus on class, and then students who attended public school, or students who attended private schools on scholarships. So the purpose of the paper is to integrate two critical frames to create one frame that I will use to look at this policy issue. Can you see that? The second purpose is to advance an alternative approach to policy analysis. And lastly, to highlight unintended consequences of policy implementation in general, but consequences of education policy in particular. So here is the framework. Can you see that? Yeah? Okay. Looks a little shady to me. So this conceptual framework that I'm still sort of developing, but this model sort of represents how I'm thinking through this conceptual framework, which is called critically active post-structural policy analysis, also known as CAPA, as you see here. Wait, there is a pointer, but I don't remember how to do it.
The front of yeah, that's
This button?
yeah, one behind it maybe.
No, I'm not going to do it because I don't want to mess it up. So CAPA comes from or is rooted in post-structural policy analysis and feminist post-structuralism. It's a lot of words, a lot of stuff, so I'm going to try to break it down for you a little bit. Post-structural policy analysis is a school of thought that basically focuses on the importance of context in policy processes. And so recognizing that policy processes don't just happen in a vacuum. They're also connected to larger social happenings, the way people make meaning, et cetera, et cetera. Post-structural policy analysis also highlights the idea of meaning making and interpretations, and how not just how policymakers are interpreting policy, but how this policy is going to be interpreted at the ground level. It also highlights the idea of, or problematizes the idea of expertise. And so traditional policy analysis tells us that the analyst is the expert, right? Where post-structural policy analysis tells us that we can find knowledge not just in these policy experts, but also from people at the ground level, again, lay people, right? They know particular things and bring certain knowledges to the table as well. Feminist post-structuralism obviously comes out of feminism and post-structuralism, feminist post-structuralism. And I use this frame to demonstrate the importance of identity in policy processes. And so although my project is not specifically focused on gender per se, it does highlight the importance of identity in educational experiences, namely race, class, sexual orientation, and of course gender as well. Feminist post-structuralism also lends itself to looking at power dynamics and how these processes play out in policy design and implementation. Certain people obviously are privileged in policy-making processes. It begs the question, who is making the policy, for who is the policy for, who is benefiting, and of course who is being left out. And then lastly, feminist post-structuralism, or where feminist post-structuralism sort of distances from post-structural policy analysis, is this idea of agency. And I wish I knew how to use this laser, but you see agency here. Feminist post-structuralism tells us that, individuals and the collective have agency. And so policy is happening, yes, but the idea is that to critically engage with these policies to also incite change. So it's not just about doing this research and sharing knowledge, but also really inflicting change at the micro level, which in this case would be higher education, and at the macro level, which would be larger societal change that addresses inequity, right? So with all of that, we have critically active post-structural policy analysis. And CAPA is framed by the idea that knowledge and power are intimately bound up, where we know that certain ways of knowing are privileged and others are not. It also looks at this idea of discourse and the way that discourse shapes and is being shaped by reality. And so discourse can be things that are said, that are written, but also implied and normally supported by cultural norms. And then this whole idea that, again, individuals have activism. So the whole idea of critically engaging policy is not just about saying that, oh, there's a gap here, but also doing something about it, right? Being active, inciting action. And yes, I got all of my ideas from these people at the bottom. I'm going to skip this. Traditional policy analysis basically does the opposite of what Kappa is saying. I'm not going to spend time there. So I'll get right into the unintended consequences. So this paper basically highlights 3 unintended consequences of the quota policy. I'll talk about one here, but the consequences that I highlight in the paper are the idea of racial self-classification. Students are required to self-identify as Black or Indigenous to apply for a quota space. The idea that, or the consequence that quota students are more likely to be pushed into less rigorous majors or less rigorous programs of study. And another consequence is the negative interactions between professors who are against quotas and how that plays out in their relationships with students. So for this presentation rather, I'll just focus on the racial self-classification piece. How am I doing on time?
10 minutes.
Oh, good. So as I said, I'm only going to focus on the racial identification piece. And again, students are required to self-identify racially when they apply for quota spaces. Now, the interesting thing here is that Brazil is, I don't know if anybody knows anything about Brazil, but it is touted as sort of a racially mixed society. It's something that messages that come from the government sort of support this. Even the way that people talk about Brazil, people say, oh, you know, nobody's Black, nobody's just white, nobody's just Portuguese, or nobody's just Indigenous. We're all kind of mixed. However, even though that there's this sort of rhetoric around race, it still sort of plays out differently in people's lives, right? So when you look at who's going to college, you look at who's in jail, you look at who has all the wealth in Brazil, it says something different, right? And so in a country where you have this sort of idea of mixed race heritage, it's very difficult to say to people, okay, well, in order for you to take advantage of this policy, to be a beneficiary of this policy, you have to say, you know, tell us, identify with a race, right? So Schwartzman, who I cite down here, does a really nice study of looking at how students sort of identify themselves and how does that connect to what the policy designers intended. And she sort of, I'll use the word lament. She laments about the policy designers' use of quantitative data to justify racial categories. And she also notes the disconnect between how policy designers chose racial categories, like these are the categories that you can use to identify yourself to apply for quota, and sort of how that's disconnected from how people and students actually identify themselves on a day-to-day basis. And so, is there anything else I want to say about that? Oh, yes. The other thing is Schwartzman also makes the argument that so in Brazil, like I said, there's all these racial categories. And so a brown person, so that it's not just black and white like how it is here. There's black, there's brown, there's darker skin, there's you with dark hair. And so, of course, there's Portuguese terms for this. And so all this stuff in between. And so Schwartzman points out that people who normally identify as brown were forced to identify as black to apply as a quota student. And she makes the argument that this is problematic because that particular identifier follows them after they graduate, and it actually has negative consequences, so negative repercussions sort of years after they even graduate from getting into school, which, you know, sort of reproduces the inequity that the policy is supposed to eradicate. And so using Kappa to sort of view this particular consequence of racial identification, I use Zianel's concept of tapping into local knowledge. And so it may have helped if policy designers, instead of just looking at quantitative data, but using qualitative understandings of race, right, to understand how people are identifying themselves and sort of using that language in the policy process. And perhaps that could not necessarily, get rid of unintended consequences, but definitely decrease the impact of those consequences. Yes, good. Last slide. So in conclusion, I'd like to point out that conventional policy approaches have the potential for creating these unintended consequences, and that reproduce and sustain inequities rather than help to sort of deal with them. CAPA contributes to a deeper theoretical and practical understanding of using alternative policy approaches, and where alternative policy approaches sort of get at some of the gaps that conventional policy approaches leave. It's also important that policy professionals understand the impact of policy on the student experience. And lastly, CAPA supports the use of policy discourse analysis as a method, which is something that I will use in my dissertation research to look at how students are making meaning of this policy and sort of juxtaposing that with the actual official intended meaning, and looking at how that's sort of playing out at the ground level. And that's the end. Here are some ways you can contact me. Email, follow me on Twitter, and I also did a blog this summer when I was in Brazil, so if you're interested, check it out.
Okay, we'll take 5 minutes now for some questions for Janae before we move to Victor's presentation. Then we'll have 5 minutes of questions specifically for Victor, and then if there are any questions that you didn't have a chance to ask in either of those periods, the last minutes that we have of this session will be for open questions for either of them. So are there any questions for Janae right now?
Yes.
When you were talking about trying to change the identifiers of using a qualitative approach to have students sort of say how they actually identify, would not the fact that they are still identifying themselves in order to receive scholarship to go into the university still have a stigma that follows them as they go out? I mean, I know that saying you're black, that will follow them totally, but the fact that they were at university with a scholarship, wouldn't that also sort of identify them as being sort of other than the elite, prestigious?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's a really good question. My first answer is yes. So, that's where the whole point, I think, of discourse comes in, and sort of recognizing that, there's meaning tied to particular, categories, particular identifiers. And so I don't know if there's a way to sort of just totally eliminate that, but I do think that, and what I'm arguing for is that those kinds of things need to be considered. Does that make sense? So yeah. To answer your question.
Anyone else?
You mentioned that Brazil is a multicultural country, obviously. So I had the pleasure of visiting one a few years ago. You have both the Portuguese, and then you have the Italian, and then some German, smattering of German
Yes.
and Japanese, and
Yes.
then the natives. So do you have some kind of stratification of the government policy? Does it endorse any stratification of these races or languages?
Yeah, that's a really,
in terms of
really good
education
question.
privileges?
So this is connected to social context, right? And so let's look at how the Italians and the Germans, all these sort of European races or ethnicities got to Brazil, right? And so at the end of slavery, again, or I'll just note that Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery in the Western world. And they also were the Portuguese was the top, I don't know what to call it, the most amount of enslaved Africans were brought to Brazil. So that's a particular context. And then after the abolishment of slavery, there was this whole quote unquote whitening project. And so they opened up the borders for Europeans to come in to sort of lessen the influence of African genes, sort of to whiten the race. And so that's why there's a large amount of these Germans, and there's a large Jewish population in Brazil. People from Italy, yes, thank you. Yes, exactly. And so obviously, I won't say obvious, but the quota system is not for them, right? Because they were there on the premise of that they are privileged already, right? And so, does that make sense? So in terms of stratification, I mean that's I don't really look at those races.
What are indigenous people? Where do they stand?
Where they also have access to the quota policy as well, because there aren't many of them in the university as well.
The reason I'm asking is because you have the Native American population here. They have certain.
It's very similar here. It's very similar where there's a small amount of Native Americans in colleges as well, in comparison to other groups.
I have a question.
Yeah.
But if someone else does,
No, I don't think so.
Okay. If I understand your argument correctly, you're saying that traditional policymaking either it leads to unintended consequences. Is that correct? So couldn't you also argue that CAPA will also lead to unintended consequences?
Right, and so that's the part of the argument is that traditional policy analysis does miss some things that lead to unintended consequences. And so CAPA is not perfect. However, I think it just highlights how these unintended consequences happen, and sort of starts getting at how we can address those consequences. Does that make sense?
I'm interested in the discourse, in the policy discourse analysis you're using as a method. And could you please explain a little bit more about how this can inform capital, or is it capital which informs this?
Yeah, so I use CAPA as a justification for the use of policy discourse analysis. And so the framework, feminist post-structuralism in particular, comes out of the work that I use basically suggests that discourse is tied up in policy processes. And so when we talk about discourse, it's not just the written word or the spoken word, but it's also tied to sort of unimplied thoughts in the way that we think about particular things. And so like Matt's not here, but you all know Matt, he's in my cohort. But he uses a really good example of exemplifying that in terms of looking at a room and recognizing what that space is used for. And so it's implied that this space is not a disco, but it is some sort of classroom, something professional going on here, right? And so that's implied. Nobody has to tell you that, right? But then discourse also recognizes that there's another side to that. So somebody else may come in here and say, "Oh, this is a disco," right? And so we shouldn't discount that those ways of meaning making, right? And so policy discourse analysis as a method allows you to sort of analyze written text, verbal, and these sort of larger discourses, symbolic discourses to explain or analyze policy and implementation.
Okay, how about one more question, then we'll move on? I saw the hand up.
It's sort of a follow-up to Rebecca's question. In terms of thinking about unintended consequences and CAPA, are you imagining it as sort of like cyclical, like having ways to better understand potential unintended consequences and also realize unintended consequences can inform, like where's the information cycle go back in to rewrite the policy and support?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Stronger policy.
When you put it that way, I feel like, yes, that's my intention. Like so the other thing, and I keep saying this, mentioning context, but I think that's kind of the way that it happens. Like it's always it's always moving and changing, and it's very fluid. And so I think CAPA is sort of represents that fluidity as well. And so the idea is to think about what could happen, but then also starting to address what does happen on the back end. Thank you. That's a good question.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Victor Soman, who's a student in the EDD program at Drexel School of Education and who also works on the College of Engineer at Drexel and teaches in the project management program. And I guess you're talking about educational technology, right?
Yes, thank you.
I thought it
Better
was.
late than never.
It looked like it almost was like a power
Thank
button.
you.
So,
Thank you very much. It's very wonderful, nice to be here, and it's a pleasure for me to address people of different backgrounds in the School of Education, maybe outside of it. I was asked to speak on a presentation or give a presentation that was given in Hawaii, and I'm going to show that in a minute. So this is nothing to do with my dissertation or any research area of interest as such, but just a matter of interest for me, the curiosity. And so it's, you can call it an armchair kind of monologue. So if you might have some ideas, it might trigger some thoughts in you, and you're welcome to give your comments, questions, and ideas at the end of this. So if all of you can say aloha with me. Aloha. So this is in Hawaii. You can see the weather is quite different, right? This was a presentation I gave at this World Conference on E-Learning. It is an amazing conference with people from all over the world and so on. But the important thing is that they came up with very cutting-edge technology. So it was an eye-opener for me. It's a great educational experience. So I shared a few thoughts with the people there who showed up. The first thing I wanted to say was this quotation that I came across is very thought-provoking. Maybe you have some comment on that or interpretation of that. The whole purpose of education is to turn mirrors into windows. Just think about that. Is that something to reflect on? For the presentation, I'm just going to deal with a few quick headings, subtitles here. Nature of technology in the 21st century. There's been a lot of change, as you can see. There's a huge sea change. Then there's an evolution of educational technology. It was very different 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 5 years ago. Application of technology in education, exactly how it is applied in education. Reflections on learning and technology, and then the future of educational technology, something that we can look forward to in conclusions. We find that along with societal development, there is also technology development. We know that in Europe, say about 200, 300 years ago, there was the invention of printing and so on, and then from there it developed into other things, and then 15, 20 years ago, 25, less than a quarter century ago, we didn't have the kind of facilities we have today. I recall typing on an electric typewriter or a selectric typewriter so many years ago, but then things have changed so much. So along with societal development comes technological development. They seem to go in tandem. And if you see different parts of the world, it's all at different levels. Then there's a rapid progress in information technology and communication, in energy, in biotechnology, and the environment. There's something that's happening, and that progress is irrevocable, is burgeoning. It is just too fast for instance, even to keep up with. Then the one I wanted to come up with as I studied these processes is that there's a combination of diverse technologies, and that's happening on the rise. If you just take your iPhone now, you can see you can actually take somebody's video, but you needed to have a video camera a few years ago to take a video or a photograph which is of high resolution. You can do that. You can send emails from your mobile phone and so on. So that combination of diverse technologies, it's on the rise. People want to carry fewer things. They want to simplify their lives in one way, at least physically. Then rapidly changing economic and social structures. We see that all the transnational borders are just becoming very fluid. The world is just becoming smaller and smaller, just shrinking very rapidly. Economic structures, downturns, upswings, and so on. And social structures, we're just talking about what's happening with the social structures around the world and within each country. So the merging of the internet, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, and robotics. I'm talking about all of these things, they're getting merged together. They were actually separate entities at one time, but they're getting merged. Then we have smart technologies, products, and services that are flourishing now. Everybody talks about smartphones and everything that has to be smart, it has to be fast, smart cards and so on. Education technology will draw freely from all of these. So educational technology as a subset of the technological world today is actually absorbing from all of these from the technology environment. So it's seeping into educational technology. To the evolution of education technology, we see that historically it's impelled by need to transfer knowledge. That's what makes the educational technology different. The whole idea is to transfer knowledge rapidly, to be able to archive knowledge, to be able to transmit knowledge, to be able to share knowledge and so on. And it says it's information intensive channels that are being cut constantly to harness knowledge. So these channels of knowledge are information intensive, and they just come to us from various directions and by various means, by various technologies and various instruments. Then we need to facilitate and accelerate knowledge transfer, because today we have instant knowledge. We can just hit a button and then we have knowledge. We know exactly what's happening on the other side of the globe. We can, in fact, there's so much of competition even in marketing. Marketing itself has changed so much because we have the latest information about every product. So it has just changed everything so much. Now globalization is also rapidly progressing. You have on-site classes because of globalization. You have blended classes, virtual classes, MOOCs, as we know. So all these are happening almost simultaneously. And this, of course, the tendency is towards the virtual because of the flexibility we see. So virtual classrooms, the reason virtual classrooms have become very popular is you have opportunities to study anything, and you have the flexibility. You can be sitting on a beach in Hawaii, or you could be in the midst of crowds in Brazil or whatever. You can have the flexibility. And you have speed also, because you can just hit a button, you can get today's classes immediately. And what's happening today on video can be accessed by anybody even later, I suppose. So that sort of flexibility we have, and the speed. Smart devices are making inroads into class spaces. So we see students, my kids today, they just come with iPads and small cell phones into the classroom, and they're allowed to do it, and it's making it almost making it completely natural for them to do. And then education plus technology plus freedom, that's a powerful synergy. You have education, you have technology, and you have the freedom, the spatial freedom, and temporal freedom, and personal freedom. So all that makes it into a very powerful synergy today. The application of technology in education, we see that technology in society has invaded the education space. We already mentioned that. Then you have items like Google Glass. Has anybody used Google Glass here at all? You have used? Is that fun? Okay, he says it's fun. So we've got to try that out. Google Glass, 3D printing and imaging, cyber robots, and cloud computing. All these are just coming in quickly, and then there are more developments because of the competition. Then Sanjay, the person who talked about systemic developments and so on, he advocates the need for 3 core capabilities to move forward with education technology. First thing is inspiration. We have to have the inspiration to do what we want to do, and then reflect on that inspiration and then understand the complexity of it. And we need continual training for educators and learners. At one time we just actually studied a subject and then went on to the next subject and so on, but then we need that continual training because technology is moving so rapidly that we need to have that kind of training. We self-train ourselves. We'll see that later. Education technology is now a structured catalyst. I coined this expression because it is a catalyst. You need that as something that enables. It's an enabler in a way, but it's also structured in certain ways. It's almost like structure within chaos. So we have to have some kind of structure to make that possible. And then we have come into a society, a situation, an environment, a way of life where we have ushered in an irrevocable era of 24/7 with connected learning from all over. Which means that the world is not sleeping at any time. Anybody can be awake at any time and still be connected to education, connected to people around the world, and even across the room or on the other side of the globe. So just to reflect on a few things on learning technology, we see that learning technology today, or education today, is technology infused, is media inspired, and the trend is continuing and it will not turn back. Then there's a diffusion of technology which has become not continual but continuous. So it is continuing and it will continue to do so. And then we see there's a sea change through cyberized knowledge explosion. And please don't look for the word cyberized in the dictionary because I just made it up. So it is actually going through space, through the universe. So you have that sea change of knowledge, but there's no upper limit, there is no cap on it. And this is a very interesting thing. We're not satisfied with just looking at the board. At one time we just looked at the slides and just took notes, or the teacher or the lecturer spoke and you just took notes, right? So you just had that oral sort of thing and then writing. But now we have visual, audio, tactile, which is touching, and then olfactory, smelling. So we use all our senses to try to learn things. And because some people say that we are visual learners, some say that we are, physical. We like to use hands, we like to touch things, and so on. And then there are physically challenged, special needs people who probably use olfactory or tactile sensations to learn. But these are all multisensory ways of absorbing educational knowledge. Then the coalescing of space, time, speed, energy, culture. All these are just coming together in a powerful union and synergy. The new learning and research methodologies, such as these are all methodologies to try to make sense of all this and to regularize and to have what I mentioned as the structured catalyst, is to something like the just-in-time learning, as an example. And then there is the last thing is a caveat on overabundance and access to knowledge. We have such a huge knowledge explosion. If you go to Google and type any word you like, you'll find 10,000, 20,000, 100,000, maybe a million references. So the question is to how, with this overabundance, how do we organize this and channelize this? So to talk about the future, how many of you heard about Ray Kurzweil? He's done a huge number of inventions. He's a great inventor today, perhaps. In 2000, he talked about the singularity concept, and he said something very interesting. He said that the human and machine intelligence, the human intelligence has been here historically, and the machine intelligence was here. And then you have this robotics and everything else. So the gap is just closing so fast. He feels and says and predicts or prophesies that the machine intelligence is going to actually go higher than human intelligence in a way. It's debatable, but it's become almost indistinguishable. Sometimes you see, just pick up the phone and then it just guides you through various steps with a human voice and so on. It can recognize handwriting. You can sign your name in any way and it recognizes it. That sort of thing. So that machine intelligence is becoming very intriguing today and indistinguishable from human intelligence, perhaps in many ways. The unimaginable synergies in scale, cost, and space. We'll be seeing that. We cannot even begin to imagine. I recall Jules Verne. Are you familiar with Jules Verne? The one, okay. He predicted almost 200 years ago exactly what we'll see today in downtown Philadelphia. He talked about glass-faced skyscrapers. He talked about speeding trains. All those. He was able to do that. So I don't know if we can actually make that kind of prediction, but we can tell that this intelligent learning software, robotics, cyberization, all these things, when they come together, we're going to see things that we can't even begin to imagine. Then there's a need for seamless collaborative learning on the go. Everybody is in a hurry. Time becomes so scarce today that you want to, not necessarily, I'm not talking about multitask, but I'm talking about a situation where you want to learn from each other. Everybody has different kinds of knowledge. So you want collaborative learning is going to become very, very popular and necessary. And also seamless learning. That means you will transfer from one technology to another very, very quickly. Then cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary, transnational learning. It's going to be across disciplines. If we just look at the catalogs of any graduate school in the US or in parts of the world, we're looking at cross-disciplinary knowledge that's happening, which is unusual even 5 or 10 years ago. Then multidisciplinary, the difference is that more disciplines are being added that we haven't imagined before. And then they're also becoming transnational, so it's across cultures and across nations. We are melding with new technologies, new knowledge. They're all being converted into technological access for each one of us. In conclusion, I'm just picking up the key points here. Speed and scope of technology in the 21st century is mind-boggling. And we live in a world of choices, but as far as technology is concerned, we don't have a choice. We have to embrace it, right? But within technology, the good news is that we have several choices. So the speed and scope is just mind-boggling. Then education plus technology plus freedom, they form a powerful synergy together. Now students become self-regulated learners with mentors. The students are not going to be sitting in a class, just listening to somebody, just nodding and then accepting everything the person says. They're going to be self-regulated learners because they'll have access to this technology, this education technology, to such a high level that they only need mentors, not professors and teachers who just who have one-way discourse, a monologue. So that's going to change. Expect unimaginable synergies in scale, cost, and space. We are ushering in an irrevocable era of 24/7 connected learning, anytime, anywhere. And human versus machine intelligence is becoming very indistinguishable. We can hardly tell the difference. And then there's a caveat or a warning on the overabundant access to knowledge that is instant and abundant. We have to make our choices, and we have to learn how to structure our knowledge and our knowledge intake. And the use of technology itself can be very complex, and we need to make choices even there. So if you have any questions or comments, right, yes, please.
I have a comment/question.
Yeah.
Thank you, though. I agree the scope and scale of the speed of technological change is mind-boggling, as you
Yeah.
put it. If you look at the internet, for example, I'm going to play the devil's advocate, and I'm curious
Sure.
what your thoughts are. If you look at the internet, research shows that about 80% of all websites are written in either English or Chinese. So that means that there's a very small proportion of websites that are accessible to people who don't speak either of those languages. That's number one. Secondly, even in a place, for example, South Africa, which has the most websites hosted in the entire continent, very few people actually have the internet. And the way I know this is because they were doing, some South African professors I was working with several years ago wanted to offer distance learning, and they had to mail CDs with the lessons to people. They couldn't do it online because not enough people had the internet in South Africa. So I'm curious how that translates to kind of, I guess, your premise that educational technology is changing the face of education, etc.
Well, thank you so much for that. That's a very good insight. I was at that conference. I met a South African presenter, and this University of Cape Town. I happened to have visited one time long ago, and he mentioned that in the University of Cape Town, they have online program that's exploding. They had something like 30,000 students. So I asked him, how do you cater to these students? Do you have enough staff? And he said, we are having certain teething troubles, but we are doing it. The people are accessing education from very remotely, not only within South Africa, but from other parts of South Africa, it's the continent itself. So I think there'll always be teething troubles, but there's also technology transfer. Now, for instance, when a situation like that comes, he immediately passed his business card out to some American technologists who were in the room, who said they could help him, they could give him some ideas, so that the flow of technology, the flow of knowledge, even in that realm, to try to expand the scope of this knowledge through the internet is happening. When talking about languages, we did really go, Google is trying very hard. Google comes out with something new every week, by the way. So actually, and they are trying to make the internet accessible and translatable. Any page can be translated into another language. Of course, it might, at the beginning when they do it like anything else, it'll sound like gibberish. If you try to translate Chinese into English or vice versa. I'll just give a quick joke. Now, George W. Bush, everybody, I don't know how many of you like him, it's a different thing altogether. But the thing is that he got someone to translate in Europe, in Germany or somewhere, the expression. He said, he said something like, we love America. He said, and he translated as, we lust after America. So because his language, vocabulary was different. So, even in translation from English, you have so many words and so on. Now at this conference, there was a gentleman who did research from the University of Hawaii. He did research on the English language, and he said that there are about 2,600 English words that if learned by a person who is unfamiliar with English, that's enough for that person to get by with 80% of English conversation, writing, reading, and all that. The remaining 20% are just esoteric words and so on. So that, these are some of the things that are happening, because there's also, you're talking about the language, the medium of language, the translations, you've got huge numbers of language. But what is happening is there's a convergence of all languages, and the speaking ability and the medium of instruction of throughout the world towards the English language. It's become like like a prime language. In China, in Japan, in all these places, you find that there is a tremendous focus on learning the English language. It's happening. When you travel around, you see that happening. Does that
And-
answer? Yeah. Sorry.
You in several of your slides, I thought this was very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you. But in several of the slides, you mentioned you combine education, technology, and freedom.
Yeah.
And you haven't touched on freedom, but it seems you see that as a really essential ingredient, that these three are all of a part. And I'd like you to expand on that if you could, particularly if it makes sense to you, think about, in the context of, say, China and the United States.
Yeah. Yeah, in terms of freedom,
Yeah, well,
what aspect of freedom are you talking about? I want to be politically correct.
What you're thinking. Yeah.
I want to be politically correct. Now,
No,
what
don't be,
aspect
please. No,
what
not
aspect
with
of
me.
freedom are you talking about? What aspect of freedom are you talking
Well, that's what I'm after with you. I want to know, you see freedom as an essential element here. You mentioned it several times, education, technology, and freedom. This is the synergy, these three things, not
Yeah.
two, not education and technology, that freedom's an essential component of this. Explain why.
Okay, I just go back to a little bit to philosophy maybe. I think every human being has got this yearning to be free. Okay, so yearning to be free means, like we talked about, I think the earlier speakers talked about slavery and all those things. There's a tremendous push for freedom. That's why you see so much of war, bloodshed, all that is happening partly because everybody wants to be free. And when freedom is suppressed, there's an oppression, you fight for it and you give your life, lay down your lives for the future generations. But many countries and societies have become free because of the struggle. So the thing is that when it's like this, is water finds its own level. When you see that one particular society or country has education at this level, there's always a desire, a deep passion, a desire for other societies or groups to want to acquire this knowledge. Okay, and so that because the knowledge is something that has been is something that is like intrinsic to the human nature. We want to know. That curiosity is there. That's part of the human psyche. So when you have that, and you have countries not just competing with each other. Let's say China and US, for instance. They're not really in a way. There's a serious competition between them, and a lot of things are happening, which you don't want to get into. But the thing is that there is a great desire and a continual access to each other's knowledge, especially when the knowledge is higher. It's like water finding its own level. It's here, so they just start sucking out the knowledge or just transferring knowledge from one to the other. There's nothing but, when you talk about technology transfer, there's nothing but transfer of knowledge at a price, maybe at a cost. But that pushes there to increase. Why do we need that? Because we want to do it in less time, at less cost, and at higher quality. So that's what happens.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, please.
So, I guess in my experience, there's a certain amount of rigidity in the way that we learn, or the way the educational system is framed.
Yeah.
To kind of piggyback, I guess, when you talk about freedom, have you given any thought to what type of educational infrastructural changes that may have to happen to be able to fully incorporate this mass use of technology, broad span, particularly in a place that may have access to this information? And then what role maybe do educators play in this whole infrastructure in making this education, the speed of information accessible to you? What role do they play in completely opening that up to being able to use its full potential and not being limited by the structure or the instruction?
Okay, that's a very good question too. I'll just link these two together. If you talk about MOOCs, for instance, massive online courses available. If you see that it started with very high profile schools like Harvard and MIT, Yale, Princeton, all those. These are schools that actually mooted the whole idea, and they started sharing their knowledge. They're no longer silos. They were actually reservoirs. I mean, they were just flowing like rivers, not reservoirs anymore, but rivers of knowledge. So they're accessing or sharing their knowledge with everyone. Now with the internet and also with the online technology, obviously it's easier for people to access knowledge once online technology becomes ubiquitous, like it just covers the earth. So everybody wants to go online. And more, if you just really study the trend today, every university in the US, just taking the US alone, they want to introduce online courses, online programs. MBAs are becoming, it was unheard of before. They said MBS cannot, become online. So, but it's become online. And technology is also catching up to make it more real life, make it to get the same experience as in class. For instance, you have this Adobe Connect and so on, right? So you can actually feel like you're in a class in a way in terms of speaking. You can speak, you can see, you can give, you can type something and things like that. So you're able to see the instructor also. So it's almost like you're in the classroom, but it could be like at 2,000 miles away. So the gaps are being narrowed, the barriers are being removed, and the bridges are being built, invisibly through cyberspace. That's what I would say. Did I answer your question, or do you have something more?
That's good.
Okay. By the way, what's your background? Where are you teaching?
PhD in material science engineering.
Okay.
Yes.
I hope you'll come up with some solution one of these days.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No?
Comments, ideas?
I have comments about this freedom.
Yeah.
I don't believe it's equally. I mean the definition of freedom is equal in different countries. There are countries, I'm sure, that the people, the students in those countries do not have equal access to technology, and like what Dr. Kudi mentioned, there are also some languages that, I do not agree with Google Translate, because I don't believe it can really help. I know that English is the global language now, but still there are some languages which, some speakers of some languages who do not have that equal access to technology.
Yeah, and again, I'm glad you came back to freedom, because there are all different kinds of freedom. There's something called political freedom, you have social freedom, you have technological freedom, access, and all those kinds of freedoms. So exactly what we're dealing with, that's important also. We're talking about access to technology, maybe because the technology hasn't come in, the transfer hasn't taken place. So that may be the reason, but eventually that will happen, that has to happen.
I guess these different types of freedom can be related, and
Yeah.
this is what makes things complicated.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, thank you. It's not a simple word.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, there is another controversial issue here. When you talk about technology and freedom, I think we also need to consider who possesses this technology and freedom for whom. I think this implies that freedom is related to, we're speaking about freedom of those who have the power of dominating and who has the technology. Because when you have this technology, you are free and you can dominate the others. In this case, the others are not free. So they are being dominated by those who own these technologies. So I think it's a two-way process. It's both
I agree with you.
power and dominating.
I think Paul wanted to add
Yeah,
something.
this is just such a wonderful
Sure,
discussion.
sure.
I'd love
Thank
to
you.
just stick my nose in it.
Yeah, sure.
But this issue, I love the way you did that. I just think you ought to write a paper about education, technology, freedom. And the point I would make is, and to your point, I think you're exactly right, that the technology actually can be something that expands freedom, but also can be something that limits it. So, for example, in China, the People's Republic of China limits what you can access in Google. And I'm not no expert in this, but I would guess that's true in many countries in the United States, other than the United States. In the United States, we have the First Amendment, but in the rest of the world, we don't. So it seems that it is a double-edged sword. It's something where, that as we one of the impacts of technology is both to decentralize, but also to centralize. And as it centralizes, then the power of that central organization over who learns what when becomes, an issue of freedom. That's why I just love the way you put that together, because I don't think many people would have done that.
Thank you. I just want to make this, thank you so much for these thoughts, because I didn't think along those lines so deep. But basically what's happening is that it's up to, the gentleman at the back is in material science and so on. Suppose he invents something today, he has the freedom to pass it on and share with others, and he has the freedom to keep it, right? So it works both ways. So I believe there's individual freedom, there's institutional freedom. That means the university, the Drexel University can decide whether to make their courses available to the public without cost, like MOOCs, for instance. And there's also national freedom and international freedom. So freedom, even at those levels, you see that it's up to the individual, the institution, the nation, the world, like how much freedom should be given. So the Chinese people did not have freedom like that 10, 20 years ago. But now they have the freedom. You see that there's such tremendous knowledge explosion taking place. China has got more universities mushrooming today than any other country in the world. Many of them are modeled after the U.S. and the Western world. So they've taken that knowledge and they're using it to replicate these things and to maintain them to balance the status quo.
Okay, thanks, it was very thoughtful.
Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate your patience.
Thank you both for your presentations, and thanks a lot for attending and for your great questions.
There's some snacks at the back. Please help yourself.